I saw you in the operating room when my soul left my body and was floating near the ceiling, one of my patients once told me. In a quarter of a century of working as an anesthesiologist, I have seen hundreds of patients who could die at any moment. Some of them said that during cardiac arrest they saw some kind of light, glowing beings or deceased relatives. I did not believe these stories and recommended such patients to see a psychiatrist. This happened until I myself experienced something similar, says former anesthesiologist Rajiv Partwan. Struggling with cancer, Rajiv Partwan underwent several operations, and at the age of 53, during one of them, he experienced clinical death. During his clinical death, the doctor was convinced that his patient's stories about out-of-body experiences were not at all funny anecdotes from practice. The day after Christmas 2010, I felt unwell. I had a fever and my wife took me to the hospital. I was scheduled for surgery that same day. I didn't have high hopes for it. The disease had worn me out and I was preparing to die, recalled Rajiv Partwan. During the surgery, he felt his consciousness begin to rise upward. At first, he watched as the snow-white surface of the ceiling was moving towards him. And a moment later, he saw his colleagues bending over his body. Like many of my colleagues, I was a materialist doctor. And what was happening to me at the moment described was subject to some new physical laws that I didn't know. Where is my brain and what am I thinking with now? How can I see, hear, breathe? Such questions plagued Rajiv Partwan. At some point, Partwan had a hunch. He thought that one of his colleagues had mixed a drug that could cause hallucinations into the solution intended for him. This explained Party's unusual state. But then he dismissed this version. Eventually, his reasoning convinced Partwan that the human soul really does exist. Yesterday's materialistic doctor did not know what to make of this discovery. Would he be able to return to his body or would he wander forever through the vastness of the universe? And if he did return and tell everything, who would believe him? I have heard so many such stories from my patients, but I ignored them. My colleagues will probably do the same. Or laugh behind my back, which is even worse. Because you can only believe in what you can see, and man is not given the ability to see the spiritual, Rajiv Partwan reasoned while in the operating room. These thoughts were interrupted by thoughts about his parents. At that very moment, Parthi saw his parents' house, which was thousands of miles away. He watched his mother and sister sitting on the sofa. His mother was wearing a green sari, his sister was wearing jeans and a red sweater. They were talking about making lentil soup. "Mom, I am here," Parthi said. No one turned around. Parthi tried to shake his sister's shoulder. But the hand went right through his shoulder, as if his sister was made of clouds, or Parthi himself was a cloud. He watched as his mother and sister went off to cook. Suddenly, there was a clanking sound of tools. Parthi seemed to turn his head in the direction from which the sounds were coming, and he saw his colleagues again. He realized that his consciousness could be present in several places at once. Rajiv Parthi recalled that after crossing the darkness, he found himself on the edge of a huge pit, which was engulfed in flames. He tried to move away from her, but some force was pushing him to the edge. I could neither move away from her nor turn away. I was being carried towards the fiery pit, as if on a conveyor belt. A terrible thought arose in my head: this is Naraka. That is what they call hell in Hindi. And while I was vainly trying to move away from the burning pit, it seemed to me that someone said right next to my ear, "You have not loved anyone." I looked around, but there was no one around. But I also understood that these words were addressed to me, and it was true, said Rajiv Partwan. He was always aware that he saw his patients only as a source of income. He treated his patients not as a person, but as a robot who does not know compassion. Part 1 showed ostentatious sympathy only to those who could be useful to him, who had connections and a position in society. Standing on the edge of the pit, Parthi remembered all his patients with whom he had been rude. For example, there was a patient among them who was suffering from pain. But her mental pain was worse. The woman's husband was dying of cancer. She expected sympathy and advice from Parthy. However, he said that his patients were waiting for him and left. Parthy remembered how his shocked colleague, in a voice trembling with emotion, told the relatives about the death of his patient. The relatives hugged and cried, and Parthy watched this picture with detachment and thought that he would have one more operation, and then he could go home. Rajiv Partwan also thought that he was also cruel to his wife, his children. He treated his eldest son Raghav especially badly. Parthy wanted him to become a doctor, and he managed his son's life as he saw fit. Rajiv Parthy's father had died 20 years ago. Now, at the moment of their unexpected meeting, he looked much younger than in the last year of his life. Rajiv's father was a cruel man who punished his son not only with words. But now the son saw another father in front of him. His eyes were filled with love and peace. The father took Rajiv by the hand and walked with him through the tunnel, in which Parthy saw all his departed ancestors. Having overcome the tunnel, I found myself alone. Here I met a being who looked like an angel. The being announced to me that I should return to physical life, leave my job as an anesthesiologist and become a healer of souls, in other words, help people with mental illnesses. After that, I began to rapidly move away from this place, flying over dazzling fields. I was returning to Earth to change the world and my attitude towards it. It seemed to me that this would be my first conscious day on Earth. This is how Rajiv Partwan described his last out-of-body experiences, who after returning to earthly life left his job and became a healer of souls.